Scheherazade's Cat, and other fables from around the world. Retold and illustrated by Amy Zerner and Jessie Zerner. Read by Merryn Byrne. Scheherazade's Cat, Arabia. It happened one day, in a walled garden of an elegant Arabian house, that a cat called Calico raised her head from a nap and flicked her ears toward a nightingale who was singing a sad story. Calico's dreams of fish and catnip had been interrupted by this winged visitor from the world outside. "Not again," she thought as the words became clear. "Soon there will be no maiden left in this kingdom. All the mothers and fathers have sent their daughters away. Next it will be Scheherazade, my darling mistress. Then who will smooth my fur and feed me food from her very own plate?" She shook her head in disbelief and scratched her jeweled collar. But no warning bell rang. Calico was a friend to all the birds. How boring life would be without their melodic tales. Even mice, held firmly under her furry paw, would gaze into her great green eyes and speak of dragons and princesses and distant lands where cats were gods. No cats ever visited the garden, however, for there were none left. They had all been banished from this kingdom by its irate ruler. The king's first wife, it was said, has run off with a handsome sailor lad. She had grown tired of being waited upon hand and foot, tired of the beautiful palace where her every wish was granted, and tired of her husband, whose only desire was to make her happy. Indeed, she was a good deal like her cat, Hakim, a large, ginger-coloured fellow, who lived only for the moment, and was left behind when the queen departed for a life of adventure. When the king discovered his wife's treachery, he grabbed Hakim and shook him until his earrings flew off and his whiskers were bent. Hakim, as any spirited, spoiled cat would, scratched his majesty severely on the nose. From then on, cats were forbidden in the country by law. Even worse, the king could neither trust nor love any woman again. He decided in anger, and with his terrible power, that he would take wives but would allow them to remain only one night. When the sun rose, they would be killed. In this way no wife could again betray him. And this was the nightingale's lament. The king was once more looking for a queen. His adviser, the vizier and Scheherazade's father, had been sent to search for an acceptable girl and had found no one. "No one," the nightingale sang mournfully in his lonely voice. "No one except—" "Who? Who?" shrieked an owl. Calico's whiskers felt a spark of electricity run through them, and she trembled in fear. "Scheherazade!" Calico leapt at the nightingale, as if she might stop the name from falling in the air, but only one small feather fell to the ground. "Oh, why?" Calico thought, her heart breaking. "Why hasn't the vizier sent his daughter away from this awful fate? He probably thinks that his power and position will save Scheherazade, but the king is stronger still and much more cruel." At that very moment, she heard Scheherazade's voice calling her. The maiden's thoughtful face was pale but lovely, and Calico jumped into her lap as she sat down on a stone bench. The cat pressed her warm head under her mistress's chin and began to speak in tiny growls, purrs, and murmurs. They shared a special language, and they understood each other perfectly. Scheherazade's anxious eyes roamed over the garden as Calico tried to comfort her. The girl listened and thought until her eyes fell upon a pile of books left forgotten beside a rose bush. Calico's eyes followed those of her mistress, and as she saw the books, she held her breath for a moment. An idea had come to her. What makes time pass more quickly than a story? Calico thought. How long and dull the day would be without the tales of the birds and others who visit this garden. She shut her eyes in deep concentration, and then opened them wide in a green blaze of excitement. I know the answer, dear Scheherazade, she purred. Here is a plan. Her pink mouth drew close to the girl's ear, and in the softest of voices she explained. Scheherazade listened carefully. Dear Calico, she said, kissing her cat's little nose and smiling for the first time. Was there ever such a friend? How wise and clever you are. It just may work. Calico was so filled with pride and love that she purred like a tea kettle. Scheherazade was afraid that even her powerful father would suffer the king's wrath and vengeance. So she married the king, accompanied to the festivities by the weeping vizier, who knew his daughter would die as all the others had. Most of the food and wine was left over from the preceding marriages, as they had only been happening so often. Even the wedding cake was stale, for no one seemed to have much appetite at these affairs any more. When the guests had sadly departed, the first evening stars were appearing in the sky. Let us retire, said the king, who was quite sleepy from all the wine he had drunk. They entered the royal chambers, and the moon made a shining path across the floor. In the distance, a nightingale sang faintly. Perhaps he was telling Calico of the day's events, Scheherazade thought, and suddenly felt reassured. My lord, she said in her charming voice, I have a fancy to tell you a bedtime story. Ever since childhood such tales have been dear to me. It will lift the cares of the day from you, excellent sir, and ease your way into a happy sleep. The king was surprised at such thoughtfulness. He suspected nothing, and had already given his guards the orders to kill Scheherazade the moment the sun came up. Scheherazade was a born storyteller. Her words painted pictures, and the plot had as many twists and turns as a ball of wool in a paw of a cat. The king remained wide awake and was so interested in the tale that he did not realize how quickly the time had passed. The first pale pink rays of the sun shone through the arched windows, and with them appeared the grim armed guards prepared to do their horrible duty. The startled king awoke abruptly from the enchanted dream web that Scheherazade had woven about him with her story. He remembered the cruel orders he had given to be carried out at dawn. Scheherazade's heart trembled at that moment, but she showed no outward fear. Before the swords could be drawn and her life ended, the king leapt to his feet and stood, hand raised, to protect her. He then waved his men away. But you have not finished this wonderful story, the king said. Scheherazade yawned delicately and rubbed her eyes. But I am too exhausted now. Tonight, my lord, we shall continue, and you shall hear the exciting ending to this tale. The king, too, was ready for a nap, and much too intrigued not to allow Scheherazade to finish her story. And so she did, that clever girl, and for many nights after that, always found herself just in the middle of a story when the sun rose. For this had been Calico's plan. The wise cat who so loved to listen to the birds had thought of this wonderful way to save her mistress's life. And every evening, the nightingale carried the good news of Scheherazade's success back to Calico's garden. Hundreds of stories were recounted, until Scheherazade began to fear that her seemingly endless store of entertainment might come to an end. She searched endlessly through her books until it seemed that there were only 3 or 4 new stories left to tell. Her face grew pale and drawn, and she begged to return to her garden for just one day to rest and refresh herself. Calico was so happy to see her that her purrs filled the garden with a happy sound. "Oh, dearest Calico," cried Scheherazade, snuggling her cat. "You have saved me for many a day, but my time is running out." Calico listened quietly. The cat's green eyes were filled with mystery and wisdom. It was not long before her mistress felt her spirits lift, and a smile of delight warmed her face, for Calico had thought of another plan. It was, as all good plans are, very simple, and Scheherazade was sure it would work. A few nights later, Scheherazade wore her usual long, flowing garments, and unseen beneath her veil, except for a whisker or the tip of a tail, she carried Calico. The king asked for his usual bedtime story, and stroked his wife's hair kindly when she began to speak in her sweet, low voice. As the night progressed, she paused occasionally, and seemed to be interrupted by a faint mewing sound. The sleepy king never noticed, and morning found her safe once again. For 1001 nights, Scheherazade told her stories without fear or lack of inspiration. The king was so entranced that he forgot completely that he had once wished her dead. He became a different man. He laughed and smiled, except when he remembered his cruel ways of the past. When Scheherazade bore him a lovely baby girl, he became the proudest and most loving father in the land. And finally, with motherhood and its demands, came the last story for the king, although there were new and younger ones for the baby. One story was about a king and a girl and the cleverest of cats called Calico. When the king heard this story, he wept, for he realized that it was all true, and if it had not been for his wife's wonderful pet, neither she nor his beloved child would be alive. And with much remorse he asked to be forgiven for his old ways, and declared Calico a national treasure. She lived to be a very old cat with many grand kittens, to whom she told an endless number of fairy tales, both real and imagined. Some of them are printed in this book. When you wish to hear a new story, Calico herself would be the first to tell you. Just listen to the nightingale when the first stars of the evening light the sky.